Hello, my American Studies 340 students. This is Professor Donald Earl Collins. It is now week 10. Week 10 in the course. Woo woo! Week 10. The week of October the 26th until through November 1st. So we're moving right along past Halloween, past the end of October, and into election week, which I'm sure for those, all of you who have heightened political sensibilities, regardless of where you stand, this has got to be a tense time. So I recognize that. Just because I recognize it, and I recognize it in my own life too, doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to talk about it, right, in a direct manner. So I'm not supposed to anyway. Anyway, so for this week, we're doing magnet schools, corporate charter schools, corporate education reform in particular, right? Including for-profit higher ed. So this is a combination of K-12 and higher ed. And your primary focus this week should be Tressie McMillan Cotton's book, Lower Ed. So please go virtually to AU Library to download it as it says to do when you get to that part of the required readings in the syllabus. It's your last book for the course, essentially, not counting anything you're doing on your projects. You've had 3 books already, excerpts from a whole bunch of other books, certainly a bunch of articles. Um, this one, these are sort of just wrap-up things of where we are in the field of education in the U.S., really since about 1995, right? Magnet schools go back about 20 years, 20 plus years further than that. The first magnet schools, I just want to give you a brief overview of several things for this week in terms of schooling and schools and these different kinds of programs. Again, with the basis of American education being let's try to produce the best and brightest and sort out who doesn't represent the best and brightest among us. And we do that through the prism of racism, the prism of who has the most and who doesn't have anything or somewhere in between, on the basis of class, and that is, as well as to some extent gender, particularly when it comes to the STEM fields, when it comes to pretty much every variable you can think of, right? So there's all that. So these remedies essentially are put in place to sort of, for lack of a better way of putting it, ameliorate or reduce the harm, if you will, harm reduction, um, for the harm reduction within this field of exclusion and marginalization, of sorting out people, and so on and so forth. So when you read Tressie McMillan Cotton's Lower Ed, think in those terms, right? Think in those terms regarding the process of higher ed and how this whole new group of mostly privately funded, large scale um, interventions in higher education um, really are part of this mix now. It's not that corporate higher ed did not exist, or for-profit higher ed did not exist prior to 1995. It did. ITT Technical Institute existed before 1995. So did University of Phoenix. So did DeVry Institute. But most of these options, for the majority of people who invested in this, weren't privately, corporately funded. They were privately funded, but they weren't corporately funded. That is to say, they were mom and pops, and she goes through all of that. But she also goes through, from a purely theoretical standpoint, the notion of rational choice, right? And sociologists and psychologists talk about this a lot. She's a sociologist. Lots of psychoanalysts talk about this too, making rational choices. Economics theoreticians and professors talk about rational choice theory as well. That is to say, people are consciously aware of the choices that they're trying to make, and they're making rational, justifiable decisions based on logic, simple logic of doing what they're doing. And Cotton applies this specifically to the dozens of students that she interviews as part of her sociological work on why these students are going to Everest College, or Capella University or University of Phoenix or a for-profit beauty school for um, cosmetologists, almost a cosmologist, which is very different, of course. Um, those kinds of things, and you'll see some of this in the first half of her book, and both her choices for her career trajectory prior to going to grad school, going back to school, and earning a master's degree and then eventually a doctorate. And you'll also see that with the people she interviews as they go through the process of trying to obtain a credential post high school. And also, she talks a bit about K-12 and how K-12 sets these people up for making a limited range of rational choices, right? So you'll see all of that. Um, also this week, this is the last week you'll have to read anything by me, and the week that you'll read a couple of other folks. Well, really only two other folks, me and Carter Andrews, really talking about the different stages of development through K-12, um, and how those developments lend or do not lend themselves to doing well in school, particularly if you are a student of color. And in my piece, I go about talking about competition and the imbalance in competition in magnet programs. I also talk about, and so does Carter Andrews talks about the fact that magnet school programs were not created originally to just train the best and brightest, skim the creme de la creme, if you will, off the top of the skim milk so that those people can then go on to college, right? They were created originally um, to apply to consent decrees, to comply with consent decrees to desegregate public schools, particularly in areas that um, do not have de jure segregation. They have de facto segregation through residential segregation and neighborhood schools, right? Um, my own part of my own writing, just to give you some insight into why I wrote this particular piece for Teachers College Record, back when I was still trying to write for academic organs as well as trying to publish in a more popular press, was because of the fact of my own upbringing, my own experience with being in a magnet program myself between the start of middle school and when I graduated from high school in 1987. This is one of the first magnet programs outside of New York City, set up in New York State in the mid 1970s as a result of consent decree, um, in which Mount Vernon City Public Schools, which is right outside of the Bronx in New York City, had to set up with the state of New York and with the NAACP and federal court in order to comply with the desegregation order, to start busing kids from across the 4.2 square miles that make up Mount Vernon, New York. And in the process, they created this program where you would have white kids and black kids, Latinx kids and Asian kids, all mingling together and in one school and singing Kumbaya and taking it accelerated, advanced, out of the box thinking kinds of courses, which is what magnet programs tend to offer because you want to make sure that white students are part of these programs too, particularly affluent white students. And superintendent of schools send his kid there, and the kids through this program, all of them actually, and several prominent business people and government leaders and other folks sent their kids through this program as well. I went to school with some of these people, and the result, of course, is that you get the best teachers, the most access to resources, et cetera, et cetera. So, and the reality is that does this really fulfill the dream of desegregation of public schools? Probably not. During the Carter Andrews talks about this in terms of experience. Yes, it's cosmetic diversity within the program itself. The program I went through in a city in which 70-something% of the students were black and brown, right? From all over the diaspora, right? Our program at the elementary school level, which I did not attend, but at the middle school level, was about 60% white. So it was a complete contrast to what the school district itself and the schools in which I attended looked like. I had been to an elementary school where I think there were two white kids, and we had one indigenous kid out of the entire school of about a population of about 400 students in elementary school. There maybe had been five people who were white and not black and brown, and one indigenous kid who was there for about 2 or 3 years before he left in fourth or fifth grade. Um, so cosmetic diversity aside in a magnet program, it's sort of skewed toward the white. And then those white students didn't even, some of them started leaving the program as soon as we started moving on to high school because their parents were afraid to send their kids to the high school because all the so-called violence in Mount Vernon. Mind you, the violence we're talking about is essentially one shooting that happened on school grounds in the 1970s between two students in 1979, right? Bunch of knife fights, that kind of thing. And I saw plenty of fights while I was in high school, but it wasn't of the kind that would have been so dangerous you shouldn't have sent your kid to. This is a Fort Apache in South Bronx in the 1970s, or Jersey City High School in the 1980s, and yet parents acted a certain way. So that's the basis for me talking about both the academic side of what K-12 magnet programs can do, slash dealing with some of the other stuff. So that motivated that piece. Dorinda Carter goes further from a more theoretical basis to talk about things like spotlighting and invisibility and isolation, and implicit bias and all of that, and either ignoring or highlighting black students in particular in magnet programs, right? We can't be average, right? This applies across the board, right? There's a saying that goes in black community, among black folks anyway, American black folks specifically, although I've noticed Afro-Caribbeans have done this over the years too, that says, we got to be 10 times better to basically be as good as white students or white folks in, white collar fields or in politics and whatnot. And that's somewhat true. It's definitely been true in terms of my experience. And so that's sort of what Dorinda Carter Andrews is doing and talking about black achievers and black achievement within within magnet opportunities. We're either super good, right? We're the best of the best. We can compete with anybody. We have to be 10 times good type of thing. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, there's this ignoring and marginalization and invisibility that happens if you're just, one of the guys, right, kind of thing. You're either not trying too hard as far as your teachers are concerned, or conversely, you might be doing as best you can at that moment, but no one notices you because you are not the standout person that Mr. or Miss So-and-so over here happens to be, right? And all of that really gets down to, theory around implicit bias, right? The whole idea that teachers, administrators, your classmates have implicit racist bias, right? They might not be conscious of it, but are still executing bias on the basis of perceived racial superiority, or on the basis of privilege, their racial privilege, their socioeconomic privilege, combination of all those things, and so it adds up to implicit bias. And so that's really the main themes of the readings for this week around programming, the segregation through magnet programming, implicit bias, the whole idea of the representative Negro, if you will, in terms of spotlighting rational choice theory. So there's a bit of critical race theory running through all of this as well. You know, although I don't think any of these articles explicitly say anything about critical race theory, that's pretty much everything you've read this semester has had a bit of critical race theory in it. So I just wanted to let you know that. I don't have anything new to add in terms of this week, other than the fact that I am going to be ungrading, your executive summaries and your first drafts of your papers. Don't it's really just more suggestions and recommendations than anything else. So nothing particular to worry about there. Otherwise, we meet and continue to meet around the issue of, midterm self-assessments. Hopefully, I can give to all of you in the next week, week and a half. For those of you who have extensions, please, try to adhere to those as best as you can. Let me know if you need anything else. Otherwise, that's it for week 10. We have one more week of actual full-fledged readings and discussion of said readings specifically, and that's continuing with Tressie McMillan Cotton's book, um, along with other stuff that looks at corporate education in the contemporary context and where do we go from here in corporate education reform. Also, you have a paper due on November the 8th. That's the last sort of thing, and I've already posted the prompts for that you can pick from to write your papers. Do not assume that the shorter the prompt, the better off, the easier it is. I would not assume that. They're probably equally difficult. You know, I tried to basically lead you guys a little bit with some of the questions. I've had enough experience writing questions to know where I'm leading you when I'm not. I basically give you enough breadcrumbs, hopefully, to write papers this time around. That might be more helpful than the last time around. So anyway, that's it.